Welcome. Today we are talking about the racial funding disparity at NIH. And I want to start off by saying, first of all, that the recommendations that I'm going to share are not my recommendations. They are recommendations from a commentary that was published last year in the journal Cell by a group of women faculty in biomedical engineering. And this group of authors is led by Kelly R. Stevens. So the title of this commentary is Fund Black Scientists. And it was published in, I believe, February of 2021, so about a year ago. And the reason that I am sharing this today is that I wholeheartedly agree with the recommendations in this commentary for NIH, for academia, and for individual scientists. And so what I'm going to do is share parts of this commentary and then offer a bit of my own perspective as a research grant consultant and what I've observed as someone who works on NIH R1 grants, which is the sort of topic of discussion here. And of course, I strongly encourage you to read the original commentary if you haven't already. I've linked it in the video description, along with a couple of other links that you should check out. And of course, when you're reading the commentary, also read the citations that are in the commentary. Those are also very useful. So that's it. If you haven't seen this commentary or really been part of this discussion about racial funding disparity at NIH, it is crucially important, not just during Black History Month, but all the time. And so with that, let's dive into this commentary. Again, these are not my recommendations. They're the recommendations of the authors of this commentary. And I'm going to share part of this document and offer my perspective. So, our nationwide network of BME women faculty collectively argue that racial funding disparity by the National Institutes of Health remains the most insidious barrier to success of Black faculty in our profession. We thus refocus attention on this critical barrier and suggest solutions on how it can be dismantled. So the first study documenting racial disparity in NIH funding hit the field like a shockwave in 2011. And this, of course, is the paper by Donna Ginther and colleagues. This study showed that award probability for Black PIs in 2000 to 2006 was about 55% that of white PIs of similar academic achievement. NIH scrambled to study potential reasons for this injustice. We, as scientists and engineers, wrote editorials and promised to do better. Yet, over a decade later, this gap persists. In 2014 to 2016, Black applicants' award rates remained at around 55% of those for white PIs. While we continue to nitpick about reasons for this disparity, one fact remains widely agreed upon. The disparity is real. Why does this matter? Promotion and tenure committees frequently use research grants, especially NIH R1 equivalent grants, to gauge a biomedical research program's long-term viability. Thus, the racial disparity in NIH R1 awarding leads to failed tenure cases for Black faculty. Others burn out and exit the academy before reaching the tenure threshold. We thus ask our non-Black colleagues to consider being in our Black colleagues' shoes for a moment. Imagine needing to spend twice the amount of time grant writing to achieve the same funding level as white PIs, while also performing substantially more service. This excessive burden no doubt leaves Black faculty less time to do research, publish papers, gain exposure, train and inspire diverse students, and attain the promotions and positions needed to achieve the highest levels of academic power. To add salt to this wound, we worry that NIH does not fully understand the critical deleterious impact of this disparity. For example, we applaud the NIH Common Fund FIRST program, which offers $241 million to recruit new faculty committed to inclusive excellence. Yet, any new Black researcher recruited as a result of this program will be set up to fail if NIH doesn't aggressively work to eliminate the racial funding disparity. So, these authors provide recommendations for action for the National Institutes of Health. So the NIH director and leadership must recognize that its previous approaches, most of which have focused on filling the pipeline without simultaneously addressing our profession's systemic racism, have failed. NIH must change course. We suggest the following. Number one, explicitly state that racism persists in the US research enterprise and that it must be expelled. Recently, more than 10,000 of our faculty colleagues, including the authors here, signed a statement acknowledging the presence of systemic racism in academia. However, the silence from NIH on this topic remains deafening. We ask, if racism is present in academia, how can it not be present in NIH grant review and research, which are performed by academics? We urge NIH to release a public statement signed by the NIH director that acknowledges that racism persists in the US academic research enterprise and that it must be expelled, describes metrics, a timeline, a plan for public progress updates, and funds committed for how NIH will build and fund a scientific workforce that reflects the diversity of the US population. After all Americans pay the tax dollars that fund NIH. Inequitable distribution of these dollars is discrimination. Also describes how NIH will invest in understanding the impact of racism in NIH grant review. For example, the NIH should study the cultural competency and unconscious bias harbored by its reviewers, differential review practices and funding disparity between NIH and NSF, and why matching criteria affect the funding disparity gap. These studies should be done in parallel with and not before immediate dismantling of racial funding disparity using approaches such as those below. And I'll get to the ones below, but I just want to pause here and say that not long after this commentary was published, the NIH director did publish a statement acknowledging systemic racism at NIH, but did not include any metrics or timeline or funding. It was a very vague, sort of hand-wavy statement. I've linked that below in the video description. You can read that too. But there is a lot more that needs to be done in terms of addressing these recommendations by the authors and actually putting substance behind this acknowledgement. And I really do want to talk about this last point around describing how NIH will invest in understanding the impact of racism in NIH grant review. This is something that I have observed in working with Black PIs, particularly Black women PIs over the years. At this point, it has become extremely predictable what we're going to see on a summary statement. There is sort of enhanced critique of expertise and experience and leadership capacity. And if the PI is doing any disparities related research, there is enhanced scrutiny around the importance of the topic, the significance of the research in the first place. So again, at this point, it's become predictable. We almost know what we're going to see in the summary statement before we even get it. And so one of the things that we do when we're working with Black women PIs is help them anticipate and address those biased objections that we can anticipate that they will see. But obviously that needs to happen on the other side as well, where there is a greater understanding of what actually happens in the peer review process and how to eliminate that. So it's not on the PI to be doing all of the work to respond to racist reviews. Okay, point number 2 from the authors is to institute policies to immediately achieve racial funding equity. Interestingly, solutions to similar funding disparities have been demonstrated elsewhere at NIH. The best example is the NIH Early Stage Investigator Program policy, which funds additional R01 applications from early stage investigators with scores above the funding pay line. This program has successfully leveled the playing field by supporting early career scientists at a success rate similar to established investigators. We call attention to the first line of background of the NIH ESI policy website, which states, fostering the creative discoveries and innovative research requires NIH to take steps to promote the growth, stability, and diversity of the biomedical research workforce. We ask NIH, are race and ethnicity not considered diversity? In the words of our colleague, Dr. Manu Platt, be careful with responding because one answer is racist and the other is not. NIH must institute an equity policy or program for Black investigators that eliminates racial funding disparity. We estimate that NIH would need to appropriate only 0.7% of its annual budget to achieve racial R01 equivalent level funding equity across all career stages. We understand that such a policy program may cause concern for some members of our scientific community. Indeed, the backlash from loud and privileged members of the majority is what has often enabled racism to persist. So I'm going to pause again here and say that this is an excellent recommendation, and it cannot happen in isolation. As the authors have already pointed out, this set of recommendations is truly an ecosystem, and not one of them can be done in isolation. And the ESI equivalent policy is a perfect example. So the ESI policy only works if your grant is scored well enough to be close to the pay line. But if in the case of building an equity program for Black investigators, if those grants are not scored well enough to even get close to the pay line, this policy is not going to make a difference. And so all of the other recommendations that the authors are making here need to happen in concert with this one for an initiative like this to work. So again, doing this in isolation is not going to change anything, but working on this ecosystem of recommendations from these authors can work to change the system as a whole. And they speak to this a little bit later, which we'll get to. Third recommendation, make diversity score driving criteria, prioritize diverse teams for funding, and diversify review panels. So creativity and innovation blaze new paths to discovery and lay at the core of everything scientists value. We firmly support the first major goal of the NIH, as stated prominently on its mission and goals webpage, to foster fundamental creative discoveries, innovative research strategies, and their applications. Yet, NIH practices are discordant with this goal. Numerous studies have shown that diverse teams generate the most creative, innovative, and impactful solutions in science. We ask, why is diversity of the investigator team not a scoreable criterion in NIH grant review and priority for funding? Be careful with responding, because one answer is racist and the other is not. To foster innovative strategies, diversity must be woven into the fabric of everything that NIH does. Diversity should not be viewed as a separate department, a separate institute, or a separate initiative. If NIH is truly committed to the most creative discoveries and innovative research strategies, diversity must be scoreable and prioritized for funding, period. To identify the most creative and innovative research, more diverse voices must be intentionally included on review panel teams. The deck is already stacked against incorporating diverse perspectives and experiences into funding decisions, as minority Black faculty are sixfold underrepresented relative to the US population in academic medicine. We are thus prioritizing narrowly constructed, widely embraced paradigms, which most commonly lead fields astray, over creative and innovative work that illuminate new routes of research. To make NIH's policies and procedures consistent with its stated mission and goals, we recommend that diversity of the investigator team should be a score-driving criterion in NIH grant review. This includes race and ethnicity and other forms of diversity, such as gender, sexual orientation, and disability. Diverse teams should be prioritized for funding. Until there is no racial funding disparity, all applications from Black PIs must be discussed. These applications should be automatically slated for discussion prior to the review meeting by an automated system or the SRO. And I'm going to pause here and say this is exactly what I was talking about earlier. That ESI equivalent equity initiative will not work unless there is something on the other side of it, like having all applications from Black PIs discussed. Program officers, program directors should be encouraged and empowered to reevaluate grants of Black PIs that score above the funding pay line and bring these grants forward to council for funding. We calculate that an average of only 2 additional R01 applications from Black PIs would be needed to be funded per institute to achieve racial equity. Only 2. More Black PIs should be included on study sections. NIH should institute a minimum number of Black reviewers on each panel and publish a timeline over which this number will represent the US population. We note that some, often in the majority, may voice that this may lead to an unmanageable burden on Black PIs. Yet the race tax is most problematic for service that is not career enhancing. Service on an NIH panel is universally viewed as career-enhancing and prestigious, and panel invitations can also be declined. The pool of Black reviewers available for each panel could also be increased if NIH adopted suggestions in the Beyond 2020 A Vision and Pathway for NIH, which recommends that narrowly defined organ and disease-centric panels be replaced with panels that are broader in scope. So I'm going to pause there again before we move on to the next recommendation, but the only thing I have to add there is yes, 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 all of that. Okay. Next recommendation, train and empower NIH leadership, staff, and grant reviewers and recipients to recognize and stop racism. Silence is complicity. The continued persistence of a racial funding disparity suggests that the scientific workforce, including the NIH leadership, does not understand nor is adequately equipped to recognize and respond to this racism. To address this problem, which affects the health of millions of Americans, we suggest that NIH ensures that the scientific workforce, including NIH leadership, SROs, and POs, PDs, study section chairs, NIH grant reviewers, and NIH grant recipients are trained and empowered to identify, respond to, and stop racism on review panels and elsewhere. We suggest that NIH creates efficient mechanisms for reporting racist or biased conduct during and after review panels. This includes developing a standardized policy to remove reviewers with a history of offenses from the reviewer pool and publicizing policies, offenses reported, and NIH follow-up actions in annual reports. Includes an NIH ambassador trained in racism on all review panels. The ambassador would ensure compliance and consistency of best practices across study sections. For example, fairly drawn discussion lines, equitable grant discussion ratios based on diversity metrics such as race, ethnicity, and gender prior to panels, inclusion of Black faculty on panels. The ambassador would observe dialogues and intervene and mediate when racism or bias occurs. Reviewers should be enabled to communicate with ambassador during and after each panel. Issues raised by ambassadors must be acted upon in the panel and later by NIH as above. We suggest that NIH includes a module on recognizing racism and stopping its negative impact on the mandatory responsible conduct of research training. So I just want to emphasize this last point. This is so simple to do. This RCR training is a requirement for all investigators. And this would be a super low bar to add a module on recognizing and stopping racism in that required training. All right, next recommendation. These are actions for individual scientists, the private sector, and academia. So for individual scientists, faculty colleagues, we respectfully suggest that it is time for us to acknowledge that we, yes, each of us, including many of the authors here, have unintentionally contributed to racial inequity in our profession. As just one example of the insidious nature of systemic racism, many studies have shown that we judge CVs and resumes differently based on the name of the applicant alone, with both racial and gender bias, even if these CVs are otherwise identical. We ask, what might this suggest about our judgment of NIH biosketches and investigators? Comments by reviewers such as, this grant lacks detail, but this strong PI will figure it out, should thus be met with alarm bells. And again, this is exactly what I was saying earlier about the comments that we can predict to see on the summary statements from the Black women PIs that we work with. But of course, the other side of that, right? The increased scrutiny on their expertise, their competence, their leadership ability, their study design, and the significance of any disparities related research. We suggest that each of us do the following: score grants of Black faculty well. Rescue grants of Black faculty to ensure they are discussed. Consider diversity when scoring the investigator team and innovation. Learn what racism is, especially topics such as systemic racism, and anti-racism. Call out and stop all racist statements in review panels and elsewhere. Do not let racist comments pass. Include Black faculty in scientific collaborations and write papers and grants with Black faculty. So when we review, score, and/or rescue applications, our rationales must be based on the current score driving criteria. And recall that innovation is one of the score driving criteria. As noted above, diverse teams generate more innovative work. So there is, again, a very easy low bar way to refer to the score driving criteria. Okay, for the private sector, while a comprehensive analysis is beyond the scope of this commentary, we offer some suggestions for the private sector here, which should collectively mobilize and put pressure on the NIH to eliminate racial grant funding disparity, create funding award programs to help offset NIH racial funding disparity. We estimate that a total of $32 million in funding annually is needed. Prioritize investigator diversity and or commitment to diversity when administering any type of scientific grant funding from the private sector. Anything less destroys creative synergy and diminishes innovation. So as a small business owner, I am part of the private sector. And the one piece I will add to this is that for my colleagues who are research grant consultants and who provide recommendations to PIs, particularly on NIH grants and on R01 equivalent grants, I think it is absolutely essential that we acknowledge the bias that exists in the peer review process and work with Black PIs to anticipate and address what those biases are. Again, this is the absolute bare minimum that we can do as research grant consultants, whether in-house at universities or in the private sector as I am. I will also say that as a small business, one of the things that we are doing to address racial funding disparity is offer our grant review services to Black women PIs. Once per cycle, we have a spot for a Black woman PI that we work with free of charge. This is currently only available to clients we've worked with privately, or previously, I should say, but down the road, we will be opening this up to the broader community. And if you want to hear about that, please head to our website and sign up for our mailing list. We'll be sure to give you plenty of advance notice about that. So, recommendations for academia from the authors. Many of our universities have responded to this historical moment with reflections and statements of solidarity, yet we have not seen the transformative organizational change needed to eliminate racism. Universities need to stop focusing only on the pipeline and do much deeper introspection. We must also identify and dismantle barriers and build inclusive support infrastructure for Black and other minoritized faculty to ensure their success. Indeed, academic hiring, promotion, and tenure policies enable racial funding disparity by building and empowering the largely homogeneous academic faculty currently performing NIH grant review. Toward this end, we provide some recommendations for universities here. Make the mission, vision, and organizational changes needed to dismantle racism in academia. Ensure that our institutions' actions are consistent with their stated values. Revamp hiring and promotion and tenure committee training and in cultural competency, racism, and implicit bias. Ensure that hiring and P&T committees know and recalibrate stated and unstated expectations based on common disparities, such as NIH racial funding disparity and citation disparity. Remind committees that a singular bar for excellence is not consistent with diversity. Conversely, diversity is essential for innovation. Understand that when hiring Black faculty, we also need to create proactive and substantive funding mechanisms to provide these faculty with funding that achieves racial funding equity, including bridge funding to cover funding gaps. So the only thing I will add there is a bit more sort of structure around how Black faculty in particular are supported in grant getting. Yes, there's internal funding that must be provided, but there can also be investment on the institution's part to support Black faculty to be funded at NIH and to ensure success at NIH. And that, I've spoken about this before, does require investment from institutions. So that is another area where academic institutions can actually provide more support for Black faculty specifically. So finally, we urge each of us, the NIH, every one of our scientific colleagues, industry partners, community partners, and universities to add our voices and act now. It's time for us to stop extinguishing careers of exceptional scientists and instead demonstrate that we truly value innovation and creativity. Fund Black scientists. All right, that is it for today. Please, I encourage you to read the original commentary. I've linked it below in the video description. And please do reach out to continue the conversation.